Hello everyone, my name is Alexander Lebedev and I welcome you at Karolinska Institute. Today we have a very special guest, Tomas Palenicek. He's a clinician and a researcher at the National Institute for Mental Health in Prague. He's also a principal investigator in the first clinical trial of Psilocybin in Czech Republic. And apart from his clinical work and his research with classical psychedelics, Tomas has been involved in a number of studies with other psychoactive substances, including cannabinoids, amphetamines, and a number of other substances, and studying various kinds of altered state of consciousness from two major standpoints: as a model for endogenous recurrent psychotic states, and also exploring their therapeutic applications, which, as many of you know, currently a hot topic in psychiatry and psychology. I want to say a few words, first of all, that this event is possible thanks to the network, the Swedish Network for Psychedelic Science, and I would want to thank the members, the steering board, and namely Philip Brumberg for organizing this event. If you have some questions about what the network does, what is it all about, just approach Philip, for example, the lecturer. Philip, can you show up some activities here? Just come by and ask him if you want to know more. The lecture is planned for about an hour, then we will have a short discussion, and now I want to introduce our member of the discussion board, Amir Englund. Many of you know him for his outstanding work with cannabinoids. He's been studying them also from different standpoints in terms of their safety, their neuroprotective effects, and in particular the link between psychosis and the use of cannabinoids. It's great to have you here as well. Also, it's worth noting that after the presentation, there's going to be a smaller meeting for the members of the NPV. So again, if you want to know more, come to Philip. I won't take any more of your time. Let's welcome Tomas Palenicek.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Alex, for introducing myself. Thank you, Philip, for organizing and facilitating all of this, what happens around. I'm very pleased to be back in Sweden, in Stockholm. I was here only once on one conference, and on high school in Cedar Sandby, and a school exchange. It was my first school exchange, so third time in Sweden. So, I will talk in the following hour about the study, mainly about the study that we are currently running and which is still ongoing in Czech Republic, and this study will be focused mainly on psilocybin. Psilocybin is psychedelic, and what does psychedelic mean? Psychedelic is a drug which in fact mediates the connection between the psyche and or connects the makes a connection of the psyche with the inside. There are also alternate names of psychedelics. One of these alternate names is Fantastica. It was one of the first names because these compounds induced fantastic images that was used very long time ago. As alternate name also, which is used mainly in the research of psychosis, we speak about psychedelics as about psychotomimetics. That's what Alex already mentioned, that psychedelics can induce symptoms of psychosis, and that led to a term of psychotomimetics. Another term which is frequently used for psychedelics is hallucinogens. This is probably the most known term which is used between most of the people, and it's due to the fact that most of the psychedelic drugs induce some visual hallucinations. So, what compounds belong to the group of psychedelics? There are a lot of drugs that can induce very similar symptoms, but if we speak about the so-called classical psychedelics or classical hallucinogens, we speak about tryptamines, ergolines, and phenylethylamines. The most common or most frequently used tryptamine psychedelic is definitely psilocybin, But today, a lot of attention is given to another drug from this group, which is called DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, which is the major component of the hallucinogenic beverage ayahuasca. From ergolines, LSD is definitely the most known psychedelic from all the classical psychedelics, and from the phenylethylamine-like group, it's definitely mescaline. Western science, or Western researchers, started to focus on psychedelics definitely after the discovery of LSD by Albert Hofmann, who accidentally ingested this compound and described its effects while riding a bike on the way home from the Sandoz company. And since then, a lot of other researchers started to explore this powerful compound, and less people know that Albert Hofmann is also the person who discovered psilocybin, who isolated it from mushrooms and identified the molecule and synthesized it as well. So the first era of psychedelic research was that people were fascinated by the effects of psychedelics. They thought that it might model definitely a lot of psychiatric disorders through their powerful effects. They were also thinking that they might be used in the treatment of various psychiatric disorders, which in fact is coming to be reality back again in these days. So here there are some of these explorers of psychedelic compounds. You definitely know Timothy Leary, who was probably the most known worldwide, and I would like to mention also Stanislav Grof, which is another person involved in psychedelic research in the early 60s and 70s, who is actually a Czech guy coming from the same institution as I am. What is the research with, or how we can describe the areas where psychedelics can be used or were used, or how they can be explored. So we've already mentioned the psychomimetic approach, which is the approach which is used to model psychosis. That was definitely one of the most frequently used research tools to explore psychotic symptoms or psychotic-like symptoms in humans, and it's definitely the only pharmacological model that can be used ethically in humans these days. Psychedelics were in 50s and 60s when they were used a lot, also used for the treatment, and there were two main therapies in which psychedelics started to be used. One was psycholytic approach, and the other one was psychedelic approach. Psycholytic approach used psychedelics in lower doses, where there was still contact with the patient, and the therapist with the patient were interacting during the session, working with the subjects, while psychedelic approach was using much higher doses, and the integration of the session was happening after the intoxication worn off. There's definitely the entheogenic approach, which gives the contact with spirits and gods, and definitely self-experimental approach. Many people do experiment with drugs. Same happened with psychedelics. Same happened in 60s. A lot of the first explorers were self-experimenters. Today, very fancy thing, I would say, is something which is called microdosing. A lot of people are experiencing now psychedelics in very low, tiny doses, sub-threshold doses, which do not induce psychedelic effects, and they speak about their possible effects on creativity, on depression, anxiety, and so on. So, I'll go a little bit to the history of Czech Republic. I don't know if you are aware, but Czech Republic was during the communist time. It was a country where there was a lot of going on with psychedelics. Actually, this is Dr. Hausner in his so-called Lysergarium in Sacka, where he did treatments with patients with LSD and psilocybin. He treated hundreds of patients, and recently a book has been published where there are reports about these sessions. Czech Republic was also state or country where LSD and psilocybin were produced, and actually this is LSD produced in Czech Republic, which was made by Spofa company. In 1974, when the use of psychedelics in treatment was prohibited in Czech Republic, all these boxes with LSD had to be destroyed. To be honest, not all of them were destroyed, and there are still some existing these days, like things you might go to see in the museum. Unfortunately, there are no museums where you can see these things, but they're still existing. These are researchers that were, or therapeutics and psychiatrists that were working with psychedelic drugs during the 50s and 60s. Here you can see part of the Czech psychedelic team, I would say, or our team in the facility together with Stangrov when he was on transpersonal conference in Prague last year. This Dr. Oldřich Vinař is still alive, practicing, having few patients. He's over, I think now he's over 90, but he also described very interesting experiences which they had in the 60s, what they were doing with LSD and reserpine. One of his very first experiments were that he took LSD with reserpine because they thought reserpine might block the effects of LSD, and then he got him into toxic psychosis, and he spent 2 days under the piano thinking that he is a dromedar, and that there are communists working in one of these things that he has on the backs with the capitalists on the other side. So he developed toxic psychosis for 2 days. So he's describing it now very vividly, and also he speaks about the experiments in these 60s. Then when he got the LSD from Spofa, and he said, well, I made an experiment with my colleagues. I went to a party where we were, and I said to them, okay, I have this substance here. Let's make an experiment how it looks like, what effects will be there. And then he continued and he said, already at the time I decided to give the drug only to half of the people who were there to see what the effects will be, and to have some placebo controlled study. And actually what happened during the first 30 minutes, those that received the placebo, they were very talkative and crying and shouting and being very happy. And the other group who received the real drug didn't see there was not many things happening on, but then within the 30 minutes everything turned to be the other way around, and all these people received the active dose were becoming quite crazy. So these were experiments that were happening in these 60s, and we would think today about the ethical issues of these kind of exploratory studies, let's say. And I think today the science moved a little bit further, and also the ethical norms are very far from what were experiencing in these pioneer 60s. What definitely happened afterwards, in 50s, or starting 50s till 74 in Czech Republic, there was a ban of most of the psychedelics. They were put on the list of scheduled substances, and definitely what remained still in the research was mainly the psychotomimetic approach. So psychedelics were still used as tools to study psychosis, also in humans as well as in animals. In humans, to my knowledge, it was mainly Franz Vollenweider who performed these studies in Switzerland continuously, and some other labs in the world, but most of the work with psychedelics was for decades blocked. When we go then into the history, one of the first studies where psychedelics started to be used again was actually a study that was run in Russia by Eugen Krupitsky with ketamine. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic with NMDA blocking properties, and in sub-anesthetic doses it induces psychedelic-like experience. And one of these first studies was repeating what was already shown with psychedelics in the previous, in the past, that they might be effective in the use of as a potential treatment for addiction. So they Eugen used ketamine in the treatment of opioid addiction. And actually, what he found out that ketamine increased the rate of abstinence in subjects who were receiving high-dose ketamine with psychotherapy, and further on that there was decreased craving in these subjects, which was significantly higher compared to the low dose and compared to those that didn't receive ketamine, and also that there was an increase in, or there was better mood present in these subjects who underwent the ketamine treatment. Today we know, and it's a big issue in psychiatry about the rapid antidepressant effects of ketamine. There were several meta-analyses published about these effects, and we know that ketamine can treat depressive symptoms, can treat pharmacoresistant depression. The effects last for about 5 to 10 days, depending on the subject usually. And currently there are several studies running in the world. The most known, the biggest one probably, is the Janssen intranasal esketamine study in depressed patients, in pharmacoresistant depressed patients. When we move on after these ketamine studies, another area or another group of researchers started to re-explore the effects of psilocybin and LSD in terminally ill patients. There's definitely a subgroup of patients where it seemed to be more ethical to find out whether these compounds might have some therapeutic effect or not. And actually, what was found that psychedelics can decrease the anxiety and depression in people who were confronted with a terminal diagnosis, and it can increase the quality of their life and their well-being. Since then, a lot of trials and case reports were published about the effectivity of psychedelics in various disorders, especially in anxiety, depression, OCD, and addiction. Definitely a very big challenge is the use of psychedelics in depression. We know a part of ketamine, that ayahuasca, has been shown that might have some antidepressant effects, which are primarily or seem to be mainly related to not to DMT, which is the psychoactive component, but to harmine and harmaline, which has monoamino oxidase inhibitors. But the effect definitely is lasting for more than 7 days compared to ketamine. And actually, there was a study, I saw a poster in a psychedelic science meeting this year in Oakland. It was a poster presenting and comparing the effects of ayahuasca versus ketamine, where it can be, you probably cannot see it, but definitely ayahuasca was much longer lasting compared to ketamine in its antidepressant effects. But also it was the first study which presented that most of the patients that were pharmacoresistant in this study were not pure depressive disorder, but there was a comorbidity. There was a significant comorbidity with personality disorders, mainly borderline and histrionic personality disorder. So there's a question still in psychiatry whether pharmacoresistant depression is a so-called biological depression or if it is a comorbidity of personality disorders. Anyway, this first paper agrees on the fact that psychedelics might be also theoretically used in patients suffering depression with personality disorder comorbidity, which is of very interest. Probably the most challenging study, even though it's not a placebo-controlled study, was published by Robin and his team, Robin Carhart-Harris from UK. It was an open-label study with psilocybin in depression, and actually what they found that psilocybin also significantly decreased the depressive symptoms in patients, but these effects lasted not for 7 days, but they lasted for a month after the administrations in most of the subjects. Actually, several institutions around the world are running clinical trials. This is just a print list from the clinicaltrials.gov website. A lot of studies are concentrating on cancer anxiety with psychedelics, and other studies with dependence, also for cocaine dependence. So this is what's currently happening around the world. When we go to psychedelics and mental health, there's definitely a big issue how people look on psychedelics. There's a lot of bad things that were said about psychedelics, that they might cause psychosis, that they might lead to suicidal behaviors and very unpleasant states, anxiety, and so on. This is definitely true. This is not something that came out from nowhere. But let's have a look on the real data from big samples, and This study on the left side was done by Johansson and Krebs. There was an epidemiological survey, and they were looking on how much psychedelics are associated with mental health problems. And actually what they found out that especially psilocybin was associated with less suicidal thoughts and behavior, and also with lower days of being inpatient. So lower days of being inpatient and less suicidal behavior when they looked on the population. Another study which was quite interesting to me, I don't know if you remember or if you know what Timothy Leary did in the past. They did the Big Friday experiment, and they also did the study in prison that they gave psilocybin to prisoners, and they were looking whether they will get back into prison or not. And actually this is a study in substance involved offenders that were released from prison, and they were looking whether they used drugs and how it will be associated with crime back again. And actually what they found out that all drugs, including cannabis, they were associated with higher rate of criminality, except those that were using psychedelics were less likely to commit another crime. So this is about psychedelics from, let's say, the good perspective. Let's have a look. Recently published study is also looking about these bad experiences I mentioned. Definitely psychedelics can induce very difficult states, and this study looked especially, it was an internet-based survey, and it looked definitely on these challenging experiences. They included almost 2,000 subjects, and what they found out that at least 11% put themselves in some kind of risk of injury, of causing physical harm to themselves or to someone else, and only 3 cases seem to be psychotic, and 3 cases seem to attempted suicide. What is very interesting, we know what is the rate of schizophrenia in the general population. 1%, approximately 1%. This is 3 people from 2,000. There are definitely cases of toxic psychosis which can be related to psychedelics, and these were people who were experiencing difficult or challenging experiences, and the number of people reporting these difficult experiences was much lower compared to what is the normal frequency of schizophrenia in population. This is definitely not controlled it's not a controlled study, it's a survey, internet-based survey, but it can give us an idea on how psychedelics might be dangerous. So let's move now on how psychedelics works, because that's what I will talk about later on, what we've measured actually in our facility. What we know, the effects of psychedelics compared to other drugs are definitely not so easily predictable. If someone takes psychostimulants, that will induce some states with a lot of energy, less of sleep, less of intake of food, because they have anorectic effects. Compared to that, if someone takes a sedative drug, we can predict that they will be sedated, they will be sleepy, and so on. With psychedelics, we cannot predict easily what will happen. The states could be very pleasant, with euphoric experiences. With on the contrary, there could be also a lot of anxiety and psychotic states. It's very difficult to predict the onset of the drug. It's usually very dramatic. It took very short time to get on, at least with the traditional psychedelics. And the name hallucinogens came from the fact that these compounds may induce hallucinations, but the hallucinations are not standard. It depends on the dose, and it depends also on the drug which they induce, which they take. What is really important on how psychedelics will affect the phenomenology of the intoxication is definitely setting. These 2 parameters, set, which is the state in which the person is, the education or preparedness of the person which will be intoxicated or which will experience the psychedelic experience, and the setting, which is the place where the drug is administered and all the environment which all the surroundings which is accompanying it, is definitely crucial factors that are modifying the final phenomenology of the intoxication. Just to give you a brief idea on how the intoxication might look like, I use a video which I downloaded from YouTube some time ago, which I feel is quite well describing all possible aspects of the effects of psychedelics. So I will show you in a minute. Just setting. This is a setting where we did San Pedro ceremony in San Pedro de Atacama years ago, and this is a setting where in the movie Fear and Laughing in Las Vegas, where Johnny Depp introduced mescaline before entering it and saw these reptiles instead of people in the bar. Definitely the setting might influence it. And now let's watch the video what psychedelics can do. Okay, so I think you enjoyed the video. Actually I think this video really describes, for people who have no previous experience with psychedelics, what can happen during the intoxication. The state can quite fluctuate from states which are quite pleasant to states which are quite unpleasant, and definitely the role of setting and the interaction with sitters, or let's say shamans, who might help to deal with difficult moments, is very important to avoid these very difficult moments which can happen. So I will speak about our study where we use psilocybin. Psilocybin is a tryptamine psychedelic, as I also already mentioned. It is a serotonin 2A receptor agonist, which is the mechanism through which it most likely induced most of its psychedelic or hallucinogenic effects. Actually, psilocybin is a prodrug of psilocin, which is here. This is the dephosphorylated form of psilocybin, which is actually the active compound which can be measured in the blood. Psilocybin and psilocin, both of them are occurring in a variety of mushrooms. This is last year photo collection from Psychonaut Facebook pages. Psilocybin voemica, which means the Czech psilocybin mushroom, which is easily found in Czech forests and probably also will be found here in Sweden. Psilocybin, or the use of psychedelic mushrooms, has a very long history. It's probably the most or the oldest psychoactive or psychedelic drug that was used for thousands of years before our century. The first moments or first notices about its use comes from northern Algeria, southeastern Algeria, where it was found on paintings in caves. Definitely people know about the use, or most people know about the use of psychedelic mushrooms in Central and North America by Mayas, Aztecas, and all the other groups. And in fact, psilocybin and psychedelic mushrooms were also introduced to the Western society, mainly through Maria Sabina, which also presented these mushrooms to Albert Hofmann. So I moved to our study. This is the name of our study. We have still, or the clinical trial we are still currently running. This study is in healthy volunteers. It's double-blind study, so the subjects, neither the subjects nor the experimenters know what they will receive on each session, if they will receive placebo or psilocybin. The study is, according to the regulations in Czech Republic, had to be held on subjects that were older than 20 years to prevent or to have very low risk of developing psychosis in the volunteers. And the study has two parts. We call it like two blocks. One is the EEG part, and the second one is the fMRI part. The EEG part, you can see the timeline. There was quite a lot of things that we were asking the subjects to perform during the measurement. I will show only some of them. The EEG part was decided to be the first one. In this part, they also received placebo and psilocybin in the crossover double-blind design. The fact why EEG was the first is that the environment or the setting was much safer than introducing for the first time, especially drug-naive subjects, directly into the scanner. The second part was the MRI part. Again, subjects received the psilocybin or placebo. As I said, they came there already after the one experience with psilocybin, and all the subjects who participated in the second part, I would say, enjoyed the time in the scanner, which was quite happy for us. So we safely administered psilocybin in the scanner as well. So As I spoke about the setting, this is actually our experimental room. Any guess where it could be? We are a scientific institution. We are also a clinic for psychiatric patients, and actually this is a Faraday cage where we record EEG, but we've slightly decorated it so the subjects can feel safe there. And if we lock the door, there's no signal, no electromagnetic signal. 95% of electromagnetic radiations is blocked by this Faraday cage. So this is where we spend most of the time with our volunteers, and since it's very close to the MRI part, so we can directly from during the intoxication move with subjects from one part to the other. In total, we until now included 20 volunteers. They were all healthy subjects, all university educated. Many of them were recruited also from our colleagues, so many of them had mental health education. What is great on the clinical trial we can include subjects without previous history of use of psychedelics. So we had seven drug naive, and with the next 20 subjects we are enrolling at this time, we plan to balance it to have approximately half drug naive and half with previous experience. And the dose we use is around 20 milligrams for an adult person. It's 0.26 milligrams per kilogram, which is already, let's say, intermediate or a little bit higher intermediate dose, which already induces in most of them fully psychedelic effects. So how the intoxication looked like? We saw something before. There are definitely some somatic effects of all these compounds which are introduced or which are ingested. Most of them are so-called sympathomimetic. Subjects can describe various feelings of these symptoms. It could be feelings of cold and hot, sweating, tremors in the hand, or like ants, feeling ants in the hand. So could be pleasant, could be unpleasant. Very important is when we prepare the subjects, to prepare them for these, let's say, onset side effects of psychedelics. If they are aware that these symptoms are quite safe, they are not experiencing much anxiety related to it. Typical effects are that people experience like that their bodies are becoming like being from a gum, and stretching like being a silicone, or prolonging hands, and so on. From the safety reasons, what we can measure definitely cardiovascular effects. These are effects of psilocybin on blood pressure and heart rate. There's slight increase in all of these parameters, nothing that would be affecting the person's vital functions. When we look on the sympathomimetic effects, what we can observe visually on subjects, these subjects are facing the same window. Can you recognize? It's written there, unfortunately, this subject has a mydriasis, very big pupil. Compared to this subject, it's because of the sympathomimetic effects of psilocybin. And the subject here, down here, has something which is called anisocoria, has different sizes of each pupils, also during the intoxication of psilocybin. Now, a part of the somatic symptoms, those symptoms why people use psychedelics are definitely perceptual symptoms and psychological effects, which are the other two groups of symptoms which can be observed, and how we can measure these symptoms. Definitely, we can use some psychometric tools or psychometric scales, which are from one point they could be administered by the sitter or by the examiner, or they can be visual analog states, which are evaluated by the subject itself after the experience. So, for measuring the dynamics of changes, what psilocybin did in our volunteers, and since we used psilocybin as a model of psychosis, we used a scale which is called brief psychiatric rating scale, which depicts the main symptoms or classes of symptoms to diagnose the main psychiatric diagnosis. It has several clusters of symptoms. Thought disturbance and hallucinations were the most pronounced during the intoxication. On the timeline here, you can see the effects in different times after the administration. So the effects peaked around 65 minutes after administration, and they still were quite high, almost 3 hours after administration, and then the effects slightly worn off. What is this? This is placebo, and there's definitely also before placebo and before active dose, there is some anxiety, initial anxiety before administering the drug. And what's this? Any idea? These are placebo respondents. We had approximately 3 subjects that reacted to placebo for first half an hour or hour as they receive the active dose. On the contrary, we also had one non-responder to the active dose, which was a female, and there was no effect of psilocybin on her psychological functions. When we look on how the intoxication might look like, when we speak about psychotic symptoms and disorganized thought, this is one of the examples of disorganized thinking. I feel my thoughts are completely disorganized. It is very difficult to express anything. A control examination comes and the sitter is asking me, what does it mean? Better cat, that is not. I was really trying to understand what does that mean, but then I have to admit that I really do not get it. I'm completely crumbled, and that simply I do not understand. So problems in thinking, which was the most pronounced subscale of brief psychiatric scales, are definitely present. Good thing is to ask these type of questions. One of the subjects was asked, what is the difference between the dwarf and the child? I don't know how many dwarfs you know. Okay, and finally he was able to recognize what's the difference between the Lilliputian and the child. Definitely it's worth to be a child, not to be a Lilliputian in his eyes. Okay, so this is how we can measure, and these are the questions we frequently ask subjects who are psychotic, and which we also asked during the intoxication while we were administering the BPRS. What is interesting and not surprising, that the BPRS total and BPRS the subscale or the subscale 3 were positively correlated with the psilocin plasma levels, so it was dependent on the amount of psilocybin in plasma. And just a brief comparison, as Alex already said, we are also performing studies with ketamine and cannabis, so just comparison of the effects of psilocybin on BPRS and ketamine. You can see that psilocybin and ketamine are at least comparable on psychotic symptoms. Psilocybin was a little bit less. Ketamine compared to psilocybin has more withdrawal retardation. Cannabis in recreational users, but they were using doses which they used to use normally, so we were not giving them a defined dose, they were just smoking what they are used to smoke, had much less psychiatric symptoms present during the intoxication. Let's move to a different scale, which is the self, which is the visual analog scale, where subjects rate their experience after the session ends. And one of these scales most frequently used is altered state of consciousness scale, which in the older version has 3 main domains. One is oceanic boundlessness, which refers mainly to the positive effects of the drug, and positive experiences. Just one example, the positive experiences can be directed towards insight, like the cosmic experiences, understanding our deep inside, as well as towards outside, like experiences of being in the universe, connected with every single molecule in the universe, and so on. The second cluster, the dread of ego dissolution, is more related to the unpleasant effects, anxiety, and psychotic symptoms. Another example of a person who seemed to lose its ego integrity, and with strong anxiety that was present during this peak effect. And of course, what is typically what people usually take psychedelic is these visual effects, and actually this is my experience when I was volunteer in the study, when I saw definitely things that were not real and were called mainly as a pseudo hallucinations, because I was still aware that I'm watching the reality, and that what I see is not the reality. Finally, the last scale is, in fact, is a magnitude, describing the magnitude of effects of these compounds. So, one of the symptoms, again, what can be described by patients, is related to the perceptive effects, synesthesia and illusions. We were presenting ERP paradigms, evoked potential paradigms, which are paradigms where people listen to some sounds which are presented into the headphones. And synesthesia means that subjects can perceive one stimuli with different sense, so they can watch sounds, or they can see different odors and so on. So this was a subject listening to this ERP paradigm, which was seeing the sounds. The second thing are illusions. Instead of listening to the simple sounds, he was perceiving them as complex music, which is an illusion. Typical symptoms which are associated with sort of psychedelic intoxication. And actually, this is what psilocybin does, or did in our study. There were quite or most pronounced effects on oceanic boundlessness scale and the visual scale. There was less present of anxiety. Again, when we look on the correlation with psilocin plasma levels, the total APZ was positively correlated with the magnitude with the psilocin levels in the bloodstream, and this is comparison with the two other drugs I've already mentioned, with ketamine and cannabis. Ketamine compared to psilocybin definitely induced less visual effects. On the other hand, the oceanic boundlessness was almost comparable. So, the last scale we used, I just don't want to talk too much about it. It was hallucinogenic rating scale. We are now validating this scale. But just what I want to say, the dose of psilocybin we used, I compared with the data that came from the old Strassman's paper, who did the first study with DMT. And actually, if you look on the shape of the effects on this scale, a dose of psilocybin we used was quite comparable to 0.4 milligrams of DMT that was used in Strassman's study in 1994. So this is of interest. Definitely it indicates that these compounds are coming from the same tryptamine group, and they are really very closely related. So, visual effects. Everybody speaks about visual effects, but there's not many proofs that people can experience, or that they can see things that are not seen, or how we can measure this effect. Since we were asking subjects to participate and watch some paradigms on a computer screen, we had to implement some paradigms that would distinguish in between those that are in between the fact if they are hallucinating or not. So we've created such a simple paradigm representing these faces and objects that were somehow changing or morphing, and part of that we were presenting faces and objects that were like static, no change on them. And we asked the subjects to identify if the objects are somehow changing or not. And actually, what you see here on the graph, subjects during the peak of intoxication on psilocybin recognized objects that were static or not changing as objects as they were changing. So this is a direct proof of visual effects of the dose that we have used, and it's a variable that we will use in the future analysis in our studies. Definitely, we know that from the studies conducted in other institutions, this is a study done by Robin's team with LSD. Psychedelics can activate optical areas in the brain, in the occipital cortex, and the visual imagery was positively correlated with the changes in the blood flow in these areas, and also the connectivity of the visual areas that were activated in this paradigm were positively, the higher connectivity with other brain areas was associated with higher or complex visual imagery. Another aspect of psychedelics, and that's why many people use it in raves and parties as a dance drugs. Actually, psychedelics were one of the first dance drugs on the dance scene, is that it somehow affects the perception of music. This paradigm we introduced at the very beginning. We wanted to have a look, we wanted to select music that the subjects will be liking in the future study, that it wouldn't disturb them, and to select the most appropriate style of music that will be used for further analysis. So we presented them various styles of music, starting from punk through hardcore, through classical music, through electronic music, up to the psytrance music. And actually, what we found out that the classical music was definitely liked the most. this is a million boys, which they like the most, as well as on placebo, as well as on psilocybin. On the contrary, Ministry, which is like the very hardcore music they didn't like at all. What we have found out that psilocybin increased the liking of almost all styles of music which were presented to subjects. A part of Sex Pistols, maybe they're already not so much of interest. But what was the most intriguing finding was that the biggest increase was for this kind of music. Actually psytrance music. It is very interesting to know that people in the EEG session, they really liked the classic music during the intoxication, and the psytrance music, you see that the rates were a little bit lower. But what was really interesting, because we selected the classical music and the psytrance music according to these pilot measurements for the further measurements in MRI, which are still not analyzed, but at least what we know, subjects who entered the MRI and were listening to music in MRI said classic music was horrible, it didn't fit into the scanner, but the psytrance music gave us to another planet, another world. So setting also definitely modifies the effects of music and perception of music during the psychedelic intoxication. What we know from other studies that were done again by Robin and his team, this was specifically done by Kellen and Robin's team, that psychedelics increased several aspects of positive emotions associated with perceiving music. So that's definitely a proof of the fact that psychedelics can enhance perception of music. Another thing is what we know about psychoactive compounds, that they definitely affect perception of time. Stimulants, usually when people take it, time runs faster. With cannabinoids, time runs slower. What psychedelics do? I found a very old video about one politician actually it was a member of a parliament in the UK in the 50s, who experienced psilocybin at that time, mescaline at that time, and then he's commenting it later on after he got already old. So let's have a look what psychedelics might do with the perception of time. So definitely very different effects on time perception that could be expected from the other classes of drugs. So what we can measure, or how we can measure the perception of time. So there are several different tools. We have decided to use a tool which is called temporal bisection task. Practically, it's about the fact that the subject is watching a screen and deciding if a stimuli which is presented on the screen, which was a square, is on the screen presented for a time which is more closely related to 1 second or to 3 seconds. And the time of presentation, of course, of the stimuli was variable. And what we have seen that the curve of time perception shifted a little bit to the right on psilocybin. It's very difficult to understand what that means from this graph, but I'll give you an idea what this means. Subjectively, people who were intoxicated perceived longer intervals as shorter. We cannot say that the time was running faster or slower, but they were perceiving the reality differently than subjects who were on placebo. Another thing which is really important is how people who are intoxicated are empathic, how they experience, how they can read emotions from other people. We used it as a model of psychosis, and what we know that one of the core symptoms of psychosis or schizophrenia is deficit in social cognition, that people cannot read emotions and cannot read the context of social situations. So we tried to use a paradigm that was called emotional morphing paradigm, where we presented phases which were morphing from neutral phase to specific emotion. And the subject was asked to press a lever or to press the spacebar at the moment when he knows which emotion is present there, and then to decide which emotion from these he recognizes. And surprisingly, we didn't see any effect on anything except fear, which is a negative emotion. When psilocybin prevented people on psilocybin were less likely to identify fear in this emotional morphing paradigm. This was already done on the descending phase, where we knew that the subjects were not hallucinating, so you were aware that they are recognizing the faces as faces. Actually, it's really fits with previous studies that was done with psilocybin and also with LSD, where it was found that subjects who are experiencing who are intoxicated with psilocybin or LSD are less likely to perceive negative emotions. And it's thought and it's hypothesized that it also might be an effect through which psilocybin, LSD, and other psychedelics might prevent or might alleviate, improve depressive symptoms, because we know that people who are in depressed mood or with anxiety are more likely to be sensitive to negative emotions present in other people, and psilocybin in this study made them less likely to respond to negative emotion. When we want to measure some of the aspects of the intoxication or some of the aspects of cognitive functions, let's say, which are also typically affected during psychosis and might be also affected in psilocybin intoxication, we can use something which is called evoked potentials. Evoked potential is a brain response to some stimuli. We can isolate some electric waves that are coming from the brain, which are related to how the brain processes the information. One of them is called P300, which is a cognitive evoked potential, which is typically present 300 milliseconds after presenting the stimuli. And to give you an idea how it looks like, it's a typical oddball paradigm where we present continuously in this auditory continuous sounds like bip, 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 and the subjects are asked to calculate the deviant stimuli. When they calculate it, it creates this P300 wave. So it's cognitive, they focus attention on the stimuli. Compared to that, mismatch negativity, which is the other paradigm, is pre-attentive. It's a similar paradigm where you do not want subjects to concentrate on the deviant stimuli, and the brain detects them automatically, and it again detects or produces some waves in the brain which we can measure. Both of these paradigms seem to be endophenotypes of schizophrenia, so it's worth to have a look at how the serotonergic neurotransmission contributes to the processing of this information. And what we have found that psilocybin induced dramatic decrease in the P300 wave during the peak of intoxication, and that this effect was the more affected people were, the more there was a negative correlation with the visionary restructuralization scale and the anxiety, the dread of ego dissolution scale. So the more subjects were hallucinating or having anxiety, the lower P300 they had. The mismatch negativity compared to that, the pre-attentive, when they were not trying to focus their attention on the deviant stimuli, was not affected, even though there was a trend, but we didn't identify an effect. What we have found additionally was an effect on something which is called N100, which is a very early sensory potential, and this early sensory potential was decreased. So it means already on the very primary processing level of the information, of the auditory information, psilocybin affected the processing of this information. Actually, this was submitted already to psychopharmacology, so this is the first paper in process from our study. So let's go to neurobiology, how all these dramatic changes might happen. I already mentioned that psilocybin, as well as the other classical psychedelics, they affect serotonin 2A receptors, which seem to be the most important for their effects. They are densely present in the brain cortex, the cortical regions, also in some subcortical regions, and we know that the cortex is very crucial for our mental processes, for perception and so on. In the brain, a part of the cortex, there are several other structures. One of them, which seems to be very important, is called thalamus. Thalamus plays a role as a filter that helps us to decide what is relevant for us at the moment and what is not relevant. If you can imagine that we can perceive everything that happens, every single sound, every single light that happens at the moment in this room, and not focusing only on the presentation, you will be overwhelmed with the amount of information. And actually it seems that's what psychedelics do. They turn off this thalamic filter, so there's real overflow of the information coming to the brain. especially to the cortex. At the same time, what they do, they increase the excitability of the cortex, so the cortex is more sensitive to the stimuli that come, and it also produces more activity itself. And it's more, let's say, chaotic, less under control. And in fact, it leads to increased noise-to-signal ratio, and we believe this is the thing which is beyond these dramatic perceptual and psychological effects of psychedelics. In our study, we did also the MRI, and actually this is something that confirms this hypothesis. This is the connectivity analysis in the fMRI scanner, and what we have found out that psilocybin increased the connectivity of thalamus with the rest of the brain, especially with the cortical areas in the occipital region and frontal region. We know it's not controlled yet for the vigility, because we know that during placebo there might be decreased vigility, and the vigility itself might affect the connectivity of thalamus with the rest of the brain, but this was a quite robust finding and definitely fits within this hypothesis. The other thing that we have looked on is something else. We know that the brain is not now organized like there are areas which can be activated, deactivated, but it's a system of networks. And that these networks work together, or they work in anti-correlation, not separately. And today, the view on how the brain can work, there are identified three, let's say, main networks. One of them is default mode network, which is a network which is activated when we concentrate inside, when we are not focusing our attention towards external stimuli. Compared to that, an anti-correlated network is the executive network, or task positive network, it's called in different ways, which is activated when we are looking, when we are focusing our attention to things which are happening around us. And then let's say the third main network is Saline's network, which is like a switch in between these two networks. It is logic that default mode network and executive networks, they cannot work in normal situations together. They must be anti-correlated. We cannot focus our attention inside as well as outside. It's almost impossible. Maybe some people who are really advanced meditators can do the same thing, but normal people usually cannot. But actually what psilocybin did, it increased the connectivity between the executive network and the hubs of default mode network. I just showed here posterior cingulate, which is one of the hubs. But there was an increase with all of the hubs of the default mode network. What it means, it decreased the anti-correlation, so it increased this improbable thing that we are focusing attention inside as well as outside, which again fits within the hypothesis of increased noise to signal ratio. And actually this is in agreement with studies done by other teams, especially Robin's team. And this is another approach which is looking on the integrity within these different networks. And Robin found that not only psilocybin but also LSD decreases the integrity inside the brain networks. And what they also looked at was how it correlates, unless which we didn't do yet, how it correlates with the psychological symptoms. And they found out that the decreased integrity of the brain networks is dependent on ego dissolution. Same or very comparable approach using the data from magnetoencephalography, which is an alternative to EEG, looking at similar parameters in the brain, also decreased resting state network integrity as presented by people from Imperial. How do we look on what psilocybin does in these days in the brain, or psychedelics does in these days in the brain? Actually, it seems they increase compared to the normal state. They bring the brain into the state where there is more chaos. This is the connectivity of the brain during placebo and psilocybin, and you can see that psilocybin really increased dramatically the overall connectivity in the brain in the study from Imperial. And this is Robin Harris' theory of brain entropy, where he recognized that psychedelics increases brain entropy during the peak experience. So another way how to look on the effects of psilocybin are studies that are looking on EEG, electric brain activity, or MEG, which is the magnetic component of the same same activity. And this was actually one of the first studies published on psilocybin, again from Imperial, where they found out a broadband desynchronization, cortical desynchronization, mainly in the alpha band. What means alpha band? Maybe you are aware, maybe not. If you close eyes and you will register your electric activity of the brain in the occipital region, in the back part of the head, we will see alpha base typically in most of the subjects, which is like typical for relaxed state. When we give psychedelics or when we open eyes, this alpha activity disappears. So this is called like desynchronization of the alpha rhythm, and seems to be typical not only for psilocybin, it was shown also by people from Franz von Weidenstein, but also for ayahuasca, and more recently also for LSD. But most of these studies looked just on one time during the intoxication, during the peak effects. What we did, we looked on these effects during different times during the intoxication. And this is actually what happened. This is comparison of the EEG signal using Loretta, low resolution brain low resolution tomographic approach, which we performed at 50 minutes, which is the onset of action, 90 minutes, which is the peak of activity, and then 3 hours and 6 hours after ingestion of psilocybin. And what we saw was clear decrease of the alpha activity mainly, and also a little bit of the theta, which is the slow frequency activity in the same areas and all the others. We also saw an increase in gamma frequency. I won't comment it too much because this is mainly or could be definitely related to the muscle activation, because people intoxicated, they just have a tension in their muscles, which might contribute to this gamma activity. From the other side, we're just analyzing the animal data, and we found out some temporal gamma activity increase in animals, so definitely there could be brain contribution, but we cannot distinguish from now. This is what happened over time. The peak effect, it seems to be located mainly to the alpha 1 band, which is lower frequency, and later in time it seemed to shift to the even to lower frequencies to the theta band. 6 hours after the administrations, there was nothing detected by this approach. When we look on our data, how the alpha activity decreases or desynchronization was related to the behavioral effects, from now the effects that we found, it was correlated with the magnitude of effects on outer states of consciousness scale, and especially the main contribution was related to the oceanic boundlessness, which were the pleasurable effects of which were present during the intoxication, compared to the unpleasant effects which are partially related to the dread of ego dissolution or to the ego dissolution that was presented by imperial people. Another approach is looking on connectivity. What I present here is Loretta connectivity. These are left coherence, so they are prevented from volume conduction effects. And these changes, what I present here, are not significant changes. This is like the trends in overall connectivity. And what I want to point out that there is something, again, different times when we looked on the EEG data, and what we can identify during the peak effects, that there is some disconnection-like connectivity or trend and disconnection which is present in the alpha frequency band. Compared to that, there is an increase of connectivity in lower frequency bands and increase in higher frequency bands. But what happens over the time, up to 6 hours, at 6 hours, this effect seems to be reversed, and the brain shifts to another state where there's a decreased connectivity, overall connectivity in the delta band, and on the contrary, increased connectivity or reversed of the decreases in the alpha band. So what does it tell us about the effects? That during the psilocybin intoxication, the people went through one functional state to another functional state, which was different compared to the placebo. And that theoretically is something what is hypothesized that psychedelics might do also in depressed patients, that they switch them from the depressive state to another functional state where they are without depression. The last slide I would like to present before summarizing what I've presented to you is that since it was the first study, which was quite difficult to start to do in Czech Republic, we also had to look on safety reasons. So we asked Rolando Griffiths to give us their persisting effect scale, and we evaluated it 1 month after giving subjects the psilocybin. Our study is designed like the subjects can participate in each of the sessions with at least 28 days period in between the testing sessions to prevent any long-lasting effects. So actually we have confirmed the findings of Rolando that in most of the subjects, or almost in all subjects, psilocybin had long-term positive effects on mood, self-perception, and that it was also one of the most powerful experiences in their life. So, just to conclude, definitely we were able to run safely for the first time psilocybin study in Czech healthy volunteers since 1974. And the control design, we found typical effects of psychedelics on visual and perceptual, emotional and psychological scales. We have found out that, confirmed the findings that psilocybin decreases the integrity of brain networks and increases the connectivity of thalamus with the rest of the brain. That it associated with the alpha desynchronization in the occipital region, and that psilocybin intoxication might shift us, or the experience might shift us to another functional state in which we can behave or perceive ourselves in a different way, maybe more positive according to the persisting effects scale. So I would like to thank to all volunteers that participated. I would like to thank to all people who were involved in the team as sitters and people who analyzed data and so on. And I would like to thank for your attention and say you goodbye with the words of one of the volunteers that participated in the study. Actually, it was a police officer.
Thank you so much, Tomas, for the very interesting and very illustrative lecture.